A propane heater that runs all winter costs around $400 in fuel. The concrete curbs in the city disposal yard cost nothing. Cody figured out what most people haven't, that the second option generates more heat than the first, holds it longer, and doesn't run out. He was 22 when he started sleeping under the Burnside overpass in Portland, Oregon. Not the part of Portland that gets photographed. The part where the city road crew dumps cracked curbing and broken sidewalk sections in a gravel lot off SE 12th, behind the water treatment fence. That lot was the beginning of everything. Cody Raines doesn't look like someone who solved a heating problem. He's got a wide jaw and a nose that looks like it got stopped mid-slide, and he keeps his hair in two braids, red-brown, almost copper-colored, that sit flat across his shoulders. He wears the same gray canvas jacket in every weather condition. He found it at the St. Francis House donation bin and hasn't taken it off since March. He's quiet in that particular way, where you think he's not paying attention, and then he says something that makes you realize he's been thinking about it longer than you have. He grew up in Medford in southern Oregon. His grandmother raised him from age 9. She died when he was 19, and the house went to a distant relative he'd never met, and Cody packed what fit in a single bag and left. He didn't have a plan. He had $43 and a bus ticket to Portland, because Portland was the largest city he knew the name of. He'd been to Portland twice before, once for a school field trip and once for a dentist appointment his grandmother couldn't get scheduled in Medford. Both times it seemed large and indifferent in a way that felt different from the indifference of a small town. He figured indifference in a big city was at least anonymous. He was right about that part. He spent the first winter on the street cycling through shelter beds and doorways, and once, memorably, a laundromat on Burnside that stayed open until midnight, and where the dryers made the room warm enough that he sat there for 4 hours folding the same pair of socks because no one asked him to leave. The shelter system in Portland only guarantees a bed for 3 nights per month at most facilities, without a case number. And getting a case number involves a wait list that was running 11 weeks long the winter Cody arrived. He got on the list. He waited. He slept outside in the meantime. The cold that first winter was different from any cold he'd known in Medford. Not because Portland is colder, it isn't, technically, but because in Medford he'd always had somewhere to go inside. The difference between cold outside and cold with no inside option is not a small difference. You don't stop being cold. You just stop having the contrast that makes cold feel temporary. He figured out things that first winter that most people never figure out because they never need to. He figured out that a cardboard layer between your sleeping bag and the ground does more than any number of extra blankets on top, because ground cold comes up through conduction, not through air, and blankets don't stop conduction. He figured out that eating matters for temperature regulation in ways that nobody explains out loud, that going to sleep on an empty stomach means your body has no fuel to generate heat through the night. He figured out that the coldest hour is not midnight, it's the 2 hours before dawn, when everything that was stored during the day is fully gone and the sun isn't close enough to do anything yet. That window, 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., was where he lost the most sleep, and where the cold went from uncomfortable to something that felt more serious. By the second winter, he'd claimed a section of the Burnside camp. It wasn't his in any legal sense, but it was understood. About 8 feet wide, maybe 12 deep, framed on 2 sides by plywood sheets that previous campers had left. He had a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that he'd traded 2 days of day labor work for. When the temperature dropped below that, and it does in Portland more than the city's mild reputation suggests, the bag wasn't enough. 2 winters of that 4 a.m. window had taught him exactly what not enough felt like. It felt like waking up with your hands curled and your jaw tight, and the specific knowledge that you had at least 2 more hours before it would get any easier. The propane solution was what everyone else was doing. Small heaters, the kind sold at hardware stores, fueled by the green 1-pound canisters. They work. They're also $8 a canister in most stores near the camp, and a cold night burns through 1 canister in about 4 hours. 3 canister nights were common. 3 canister nights when you're making $40 a day doing site cleanup is a calculation that doesn't work for long. And the propane heaters had another problem nobody talked about. You can't sleep with them running in an enclosed space. Carbon monoxide. So you run the heater until you're warm enough to stop shivering, then you turn it off, then you try to fall asleep before the heat dissipates, which takes maybe 20 minutes. After that, the enclosure is cold again, and you're back to waiting for the next canister cycle. Cody bought propane for 6 weeks, and then he stopped buying it because he couldn't keep doing the math and still eat. He started paying attention to the concrete. The disposal lot on SE 12th is not a secret, but it's not advertised either. The city road department brings broken curb sections there. The rectangular concrete blocks that edge city streets, typically 6 inches wide, 18 inches tall, maybe 4 feet long, when they're pulled up during resurfacing projects. Some crack during removal, some are just old and worn. The city pays a private hauler to take most of it to a crushing facility. But there's always a lag. Sections sit in that lot for days, sometimes weeks before the hauler comes. During active resurfacing season, the lot fills and empties on a rolling cycle. During slower months, material sits longer. Cody had walked past that lot 100 times. It was on the route between the camp and the day labor staging area, where he waited for site work each morning. He'd registered it the same way you register anything you pass every day, as background, as texture, as the particular smell of gravel and exhaust that meant you were on SE 12. He wasn't looking at it as anything useful. He was looking at it as a lot full of concrete. He started looking at it differently after he read something in a pamphlet about passive solar design that someone had left at the library on Belmont. The library was important to Cody in a practical way. It was warm, it had bathrooms, and the staff at the Belmont branch had a policy of not hassling people who came in quietly and used the space without causing problems. He went there most mornings when he didn't have work. He read whatever was on the display shelves near the entrance, which is where the library put material that was either new or had been returned and wasn't reshelved yet. The passive solar pamphlet was not new. It looked like it had been printed in the early 2000s, maybe by an extension service or a homesteading organization, and it had the slightly faded quality of something that had been photocopied a few times. It was aimed at rural landowners building their own structures. It talked about orientation, about glazing ratios, about which way your longest wall should face. Most of it wasn't relevant to anything in Cody's situation. But one section talked about thermal mass, the property of dense, heavy materials to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. The example it used was stone, rammed earth walls, concrete floors. It said that 4 inches of concrete could absorb a full day's worth of passive solar gain and release it over 8 to 10 hours after the sunset. He sat with that word, thermal mass, for about a week. He kept coming back to it. He'd lie in the sleeping bag at 4 a.m., in that particular cold that he knew by feel now, and think about 8 to 10 hours. He thought about the disposal lot on SE 12th. He thought about the fact that those sections were just sitting there, replacing themselves constantly, free to anyone who wanted to move them. Then he went to the lot and started moving curbs. The first attempt was rough. He dragged 4 sections back to his camp, maybe a quarter mile, one at a time, balancing each piece on a small 2-wheeled dolly he'd borrowed from a neighbor in the camp named Marcus, who used it to haul his tools to day labor sites. Each section weighed somewhere between 60 and 90 pounds, depending on how cracked it was. The move took most of an afternoon. He stacked them in an L shape on 2 sides of his sleeping space, 2 sections high on each arm. The idea was simple. The concrete faces the fire source, absorbs the heat during the hours when he could burn wood or anything else he had, and then holds that heat and radiates it slowly outward after the fire dies. The first night, it didn't work the way he expected. Not because the physics was wrong. The physics was exactly right. The problem was positioning. He'd placed the L too far from where he slept. The concrete was radiating heat, but it was radiating it into open air behind him. He spent the night with warm concrete 3 feet away from his face and cold ground under his back. The next morning, he rebuilt it. He pulled the sleeping space closer in, tightened the angle, put a piece of corrugated metal sheeting, salvaged from a pile near the camp, across the open top to hold heat instead of letting it rise and disperse. The second night was different, noticeably different. He said later that he lay there in the dark and kept expecting it to stop, expecting the cold to come back. It didn't. The concrete kept releasing heat for hours after he'd stopped feeding the fire. He slept through the night without waking up once, which hadn't happened in weeks. Over the next month, Cody kept refining it. He figured out that the orientation mattered. The concrete faces needed to face inward, toward the sleeping position, with the shortest distance between the surface and his body. He figured out that 2 sections high wasn't enough. The heat radiated from all surfaces, but the vertical surface facing him was doing most of the work. He added a third layer on one side, which wasn't easy. Those top sections had to be wedged and shimmed carefully so they didn't shift. He figured out that not all curbs are the same. The older sections, the ones that had been in the ground for decades, were denser. They absorbed more and released more. The newer ones, lighter gray, often with rebar stubs still embedded, cracked more easily and didn't hold heat as well. He started selecting specific sections from the lot. Learned to read the surface. The dark, close-grained ones were what he wanted. He expanded the thermal wall. What started as an L became 3 full sides, a U shape that enclosed the sleeping area on 3 sides with a low opening at the foot. The corrugated metal roof piece was replaced with a section of OSB board he found on a job site, coated with a layer of aluminum foil tape on the underside to reflect radiant heat back down. By January, roughly 6 weeks after the first attempt, he had something that held heat from a 1-hour evening fire all the way to 6 a.m. He checked this with a thermometer he borrowed from the camp's shared supply box. Outside temperature, 29 degrees. Inside his enclosure, 4 hours after the last wood burned, 54 degrees. He did not have a propane canister. He spent nothing that night on heat. Marcus was the first person to ask him directly how he'd done it. Marcus is 47, originally from Bakersfield, and he'd been at the Burnside camp longer than almost anyone else there. He watched Cody move Kerbs for weeks without saying much. That was Marcus's way. He observed, he filed things, and when he was ready, he asked. He'd done construction work in California for most of his adult life, framing and foundation, and he had the habit of a person who'd spent years reading structures before touching them. He came to me in December, Cody said. He came over and looked at what I'd built, and he just said, "Explain this to me." So Cody explained it. The thermal mass principle, the positioning, the selection process for which sections to take, the difference between holding heat and generating it, that the concrete isn't creating warmth, it's borrowing it and lending it back later. Marcus stood there with his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly, the way he looked when he was computing something. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both specific. He asked whether the type of aggregate in the concrete made a difference, because in his experience, different concrete mixes behave differently in heat. He asked whether the fire source needed to be inside the U, or could it be external, because he had a neighbor whose fire pit was in a shared space they both used, and he didn't want to move it. Cody didn't know the answer to the first question. He told him he thought denser was better, but he hadn't tested different types side by side. For the second question, the answer was that external worked but less efficiently. The sections needed direct radiant exposure from the fire, not just warm air. So the closer the source the better, and inside the U was meaningfully better than outside it. Marcus said he wanted to try it. They spent an afternoon moving sections for Marcus's space. Marcus had a slightly different situation. His area was more exposed on one side, open to wind coming off the river when conditions were right. The camp at Burnside isn't sheltered equally in every section. The eastern end, where Marcus had staked out, caught wind that rolled off the Willamette and ran west along the underpass. On calm nights, it didn't matter. On the nights that had wind, it mattered a lot. The solution there was to angle the open face of the U slightly away from the prevailing wind, which runs northeast in that spot, and use a secondary piece of plywood to break the draft before it reached the thermal enclosure. Marcus found a better piece of plywood than Cody had been working with. A full 4x8 sheet, barely warped, from a dumpster behind a construction site on Hawthorne. He positioned it on the northeast-facing side, leaned at an angle, staked at the base with rebar scraps, an imperfect solution, but it cut the wind to the point where the thermal mass could do its job. Marcus's first fully warm night happened about 5 days later. He came and found Cody the next morning, and they didn't say much about it. They didn't have to. Marcus had been on the street for 3 years at that point. He knew what cold nights felt like. He knew what not cold felt like. The difference was its own language. By February, 3 other people in the camp had built versions of it. No 2 were identical. Everyone adapted to what their section of the camp allowed: available space, wind exposure, proximity to the fire ring. One woman, whose name Cody only knew as Becca, built hers with sections arranged in a full circle. More labor-intensive to move into position, but significantly more efficient, because there were no exposed corners losing heat. A full enclosure with no open-face gap meant less heat escaped per hour after the fire died. She ran her fire for 90 minutes and reported staying warm until 7 a.m. She sourced her sections from a different disposal point entirely, a road maintenance staging area near the Moda Center that she'd spotted while doing a walk for a job interview. Different curb type, slightly different dimensions, but same principle. The knowledge moved the way useful things move through camps, person to person, shown more than explained, adjusted to each situation. Cody wasn't teaching it. He was demonstrating it, and people drew their own conclusions from watching. The problem that keeps most people from building something like this isn't knowledge, it's movement. The disposal lots aren't advertised. Most people cycling through the shelter system don't stay in one place long enough to scout them. You need to be in the same location for at least a few weeks to learn what's around you at that granular level. Which lots get restocked, which city maintenance crews dump where, what the cycle looks like. The shelter system, designed to prevent permanent camp formation, actually prevents people from staying long enough to figure out how to improve their situation. Cody had stability in his spot at Burnside in that informal, unwritten way. That stability is what let him solve the heating problem. People who cycle through shelters, 3 nights here, 2 nights there, a week elsewhere, don't get that window. They're not going to spend an afternoon moving 70-pound concrete sections to a spot they might leave next week. He knows this. He said it plainly. What I did only worked because I could stay put. If they'd swept me twice that winter, I don't figure this out. The sweep happened in March. City crews came in with 72-hour notices posted to the camp. Orange paper notices, stapled to posts and taped to structures, and then returned with a 4-hour compliance window and a cleanup team. The notices were technically adequate in the legal sense. In a practical sense, 72 hours is not enough time to relocate what Cody had built, and everyone in the camp knew it. You take what you can carry, you leave what you can't. Cody packed his sleeping bag, his tools, his dolly, the OSB board because it was light enough. He left the concrete, 11 sections, moved one at a time, selected over weeks from the lot on SE 12th. He walked away from it with his dolly and his bag, and stood at the edge of the block while the cleanup crew loaded the sections into a truck, along with everything else that couldn't be carried. He said he felt something watching that, but he said it in a way that made clear he wasn't going to describe what the something was. He said he noted it and moved on, which is the kind of thing you say when you've had enough practice moving on that it becomes a separate skill from feeling the thing that requires it. He rebuilt at a new location, a different section of the camp, further under the bridge. A pocket he'd had his eye on because it was protected on 3 sides by the concrete support columns of the overpass structure itself. The columns weren't thermal mass in the way he'd been using it, but they were barriers, and barriers cut wind, and cutting wind was half the battle. He still needed the curbs for stored heat, but the column placement meant he needed fewer 2 walls of concrete sections instead of 3, because the columns did the third wall's work for free. It took him 3 weeks to source new sections from a lot he hadn't used before, off Powell Boulevard, near a utility project that had pulled up a long run of curbing on both sides of the street. Different sections than the SE 12th lot, slightly lighter in color, a different aggregate mix, probably 20 years newer. He tested them. They held heat adequately, not as well as the old dense sections, but adequately. Good enough. The rebuild was faster than the original, not because anything about the physical work was easier. The sections still weighed the same. The dolly still required the same effort, but because he wasn't figuring anything out this time. He wasn't experimenting. He knew the U-shaped dimensions that worked. He knew the height. He knew which way to angle the opening. He knew how long to run the fire. He set it up in 3 sessions across 3 days, and on the 4th day he had heat. Marcus had also been swept. He was at a different part of the camp now, and he rebuilt without Cody's help, which is how Cody knew the knowledge had actually transferred, not just borrowed, but owned. Marcus made one improvement that Cody hadn't thought of. He sourced a section of ceramic floor tile from a renovation dumpster and laid it across the top surface of the concrete sections on the interior-facing side. Ceramic tile holds heat differently than raw concrete. It radiates more uniformly and feels warmer to the touch, which matters when your face is 12 inches from the surface all night. It was a small refinement. Marcus explained it to Cody with the same flat efficiency that Cody used to explain everything to everyone else. What he built isn't a house in any conventional sense. Let's be clear about that. It doesn't have a floor. It doesn't have running water. It doesn't solve the legal problem, the employment problem, the documentation problem, the health problem. It solves one thing: nighttime temperature inside a sleeping space, using material that costs nothing that any adult with access to the right disposal sites and a dolly can move. It solved that one thing reliably. In a situation where unreliable heat has direct consequences, hypothermia is not rare in Portland winters, it's documented and recurring. Solving that one thing reliably is not a small thing. Cody said this the same way he says everything, flat and without emphasis. I stopped being cold at night. That's the whole thing. He got a caseworker assigned in April after the March sweep. Her name is Deanna Flores, and she works out of the Join Organization office on Net Sandy. She said when she first met Cody, she asked him, as she asks everyone, what his most pressing immediate need was. He said heat. She started to explain the propane voucher program. He said he didn't need propane. It took her a few minutes to understand what he was describing. Then she went to the camp to see it. I've worked in this field for 9 years, she said. I've seen people build some genuinely sophisticated things with nothing. This was different because it was replicable. He wasn't using a skill that required training. He was using a material that most cities are actively getting rid of. Deanna connected Cody to a program through Transition Projects that provides transitional housing, a shared apartment unit, 6-month term. He moved in 6 weeks after the April meeting. He's been there since. He works part-time at a warehouse in Northeast Portland, sorting returns. He's on a wait list for a subsidized permanent unit. He still talks about the concrete. Not with sentimentality, more like someone who learned something they can't unknow, and is slightly annoyed that nobody else seems to have written it down properly. The process, as he described it, step by step. First, find the disposal site. Road maintenance lots, public works staging areas, demolition sites where curbing is being pulled. Portland has at least 4 that he identified. Other cities have equivalents. The curbs are generally considered waste material at the point where they're removed. The city has paid to take them out and will pay again to crush them, which means in the window between removal and crushing, they're often available for the asking. Cody never asked formally, he just took them. No one stopped him. He acknowledges that's not a universal experience, that for some people, showing up at a city lot and loading concrete sections onto a dolly might go differently. That's a real barrier, and he doesn't pretend it isn't. Second, select the right sections. Dense, dark-surfaced, close-grained. Minimal cracking, no rebar stubs if possible. They make handling harder and the section is probably compromised. Sections that are still rectangular, not sheared at an angle during removal. Weight is actually an asset here. A heavier section holds more heat. Third, position. The open face of the U-shape needs to face away from prevailing wind. The interior surfaces should be as close to the sleeping position as practical. 18 inches is workable, 12 is better. Height matters, 2 sections minimum, 3 preferred. The top needs covering. Any reflective or insulating material slows heat loss upward. Fourth, the fire source. Wood in Cody's case, scrap lumber from construction sites, pallets, whatever was dry. The fire doesn't need to run all night, it needs to run long enough to saturate the concrete, which takes 1 to 2 hours of sustained heat, depending on the section size. After that, you let it die down and the concrete does the rest. Fifth, patience. The first night might not be the warm night. The concrete needs a few cycles of heating and cooling to really come alive, the same way a cast iron pan seasons over time. By the third or fourth night with the same structure, it performs measurably better than the first. The test Cody still offers to anyone who asks, do one night in a standard sleeping bag, uninsulated with whatever you're currently using. Note how many times you wake up cold. Then build the simplest version of this, even 2 sections, even just one side, even just a partial barrier, and do the same night again. The number of wake-ups is the data. You don't need a thermometer. You already know what cold sleep feels like. He said he's explained this to maybe 15 people over the past year. Not all of them have tried it. The ones who tried it have not gone back to propane. There are things this doesn't fix. He's clear on that, maybe more clear than anyone else would be, because he lived it. It doesn't fix the legal status of the camp. A thermal enclosure built from city disposal material is still in the legal structure on city right-of-way, and it will be swept the same as anything else when the crews come. The concrete stays behind. Everything built stays behind. You rebuild. It doesn't fix exposure during the day. Nighttime temperature inside an insulated enclosure is one problem. Daytime exposure, the cold while working, waiting, moving, is a separate problem with different solutions that Cody hasn't spent as much time on. It doesn't fix Portland's housing shortage, or the shelter capacity gap, or the wait list that was 11 weeks long in 2022, and is longer now. It doesn't fix any of that. It fixes one night's temperature. That's the honest total of what it does. Cody wouldn't want you to think it's more than that. But think for a second about what one night's sleep without waking up cold actually does to a person. Think about what it does across a week, a month, what it does to your ability to get up and show up somewhere the next morning, what it does to the slow physical wearing down that happens when your body never fully rests because it's always managing temperature. There's a version of this that's measurable in health outcomes and cognitive function and employment follow-through. Cody doesn't talk about it that way, he just says he stopped being tired all the time. He doesn't know exactly what the connection is. He's pretty sure there is one. The copper red braids and the gray canvas jacket and the flat way he explains things, none of it matches the way the story usually gets told. There's usually something in these stories that signals transformation more obviously. A turning point that arrives with music. A single moment that changes everything. Cody's version doesn't have that. It has a pamphlet from the library, a borrowed dolly, an afternoon of heavy lifting, a second night that was warmer than the first. The thing that worked came from paying attention to what was already there, a pile of material the city wanted to get rid of, and reading one piece of information that connected them. That's the whole mechanism. There's nothing in it that required luck or unusual resources or a particular kind of talent. There's nothing in it that other people in the same situation couldn't replicate, given time in one place and access to a disposal lot. Deanna Flores, his caseworker, said something about this that stuck. She said the barrier isn't physical and it isn't informational. The barrier is the assumption that solutions for people in that situation have to come from outside, from programs, from organizations, from managed processes. Cody didn't wait for someone to bring him heat, she said. He found what was sitting in a lot 3 blocks away and figured out the physics on his own. That's not unusual for people in that situation. What's unusual is that he had the time and the stability to act on it. He's in the transitional apartment now. He keeps the room warm with a standard electric baseboard heater that came with the unit. He said it feels strange to have heat that you don't have to build. He goes back to the Burnside camp sometimes. Not often. When he does, He walks past the corner where his thermal enclosure used to be. Nothing's there now. The site was swept, cleared, repaved in one section during a city maintenance cycle. No trace of it. But Marcus rebuilt at his new spot and still has a version of it running. And Becca, he ran into her at the join office 2 months ago. She's at a different camp, different part of the city, same method. Told him she'd explained it to 4 people there. The knowledge moved on its own, which is usually how useful things travel. Not through a program, not through a publication. Through people talking in camps, which is where the real exchange happens, the thing that doesn't make it into any city report. Cody Raines solved one problem well. He solved it with material the city considered waste, with physics that's been understood for centuries, and with the kind of slow, careful attention you only develop when you have no other option. He'll tell you himself what it didn't solve. He's clear-eyed about the gap between one warm night and a life that works. But he also knows that the warm nights stacked up into something. He doesn't call it a turning point. He just says he stopped being exhausted. And from there, the other things, the caseworker, the apartment, the warehouse job, the wait list, became things he could actually show up for. That's not everything. He'd say, it's not everything, it's something.